So I'm going to speak in English because my Croatian, when I get nervous, becomes really funny. So I'm today come to speak to you about creativity. And creativity, I've given a sort of generic definition for it here, but I've through my life realized that it's an amazing tool, which actually not only evolved me and changed my thought processes, but with which I realized I could solve many problems. And so I'm going to take you on a journey through my life and certain specific moments, which if I made a line through them, it would end up bringing me to the path I am today. So with the introduction of me seeming like some sort of strange being, I guess the only classification I ever had was as a multicultural mutt. And at the age of 6 months, I was already on a plane. At the age of 3, I was speaking 3 languages. And by the age of 5, my identity consisted of 3 very specific spaces. We're talking about the 1970s here. And I was living in the US in a sort of international hub. And then traveling every summer to ex-Yugoslavia, where I was, impressed by pioneers and a general in a white outfit in every sort of public space. And then I was spending my winters in India, where I was most impressed by the fact that in big cities, cows and monkeys were walking around. So with this type of identity, which now I'm very happy that I was brought up that way, it made me who I am. But as a child, it was definitely very challenging because there wasn't that many people, actually there was no one, who I could express my whole life with. My cat was often a good listener, but ultimately the way I found a voice for myself and dealt with my identity was through drawing and writing. And then 1991 came, and it was the first time that I had moved after 10 years from the US to Vienna, Austria. And I felt fully a foreigner. I didn't speak the language. I was living without my parents. And the war in Croatia had started. And this for me was devastating because Croatia was one of my pieces of my identity. And it was something that I held very close. And all of a sudden, I found myself with pocket money as a student, with no fighting skills to mention, and no one to really talk to. And needless to say, there was also a certain amount of prejudice towards refugees from Croatia and Bosnia, as we're experiencing now with refugees from Syria. So I felt helpless, hopeless, and completely lost. And this is when I started realizing that creativity might be my savior. And the impulse which made me get to this was the bombing of Dubrovnik, which is actually funny for me that I'm discussing this today here. And I, as a child, figured that this place could disappear and that places that I intimately knew and buildings would one day just not exist. And so I felt it was my duty to start documenting these places. And then first my first painting ever was Sveti Vlaho. Then I started documenting memories. And then all of a sudden I realized that this immaterial thing was actually a tool. And so I realized that next to my high school, there was an elementary school which had donated one of its classrooms for refugee children. And so I came there and I volunteered to be their English and art teacher. And needless to say, I was still being taught and I was ditching school to be with these children. And now in retrospect, I realized that this was an amazing group therapy moment for all of us because I wasn't really teaching them anything. I was actually distracting them. We were having a moment where we were transforming anguish into something positive, through colors, through forms. And so this made me think, I want to be an artist, to the great dismay of my father, who considers art a hobby and not a profession. But needless to say, I went onwards, and I started getting my pedigree, let's say. And I went to Brown University, and that was a very liberal university, and I was even more convinced that I wanted to be an artist. And then I did what 25% of my graduating class did, and that was migrate to New York. And so I came to New York, And I was lucky to get an internship at the Gagosian Gallery, and that was very prestigious, and everyone wore black. I'm still wearing black. And the gallery was very wide and intimidating, and I got to see what the art market looked like. And I wasn't too impressed. And then I was lucky that I got the Van Leer Curatorial Fellowship at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. And I was even luckier that I had as my first mentor and boss a woman named Paola Antonelli, who is an Italian director of, now chief curator of design. And she was someone who was always trying to create innovative, interactive exhibitions, which is sort of rare at MoMA. And so here is one of the exhibitions we worked on, just to sort of have you understand what I mean by that. For example, these objects of Achille Castiglione, which one might think, what is this about? She actually worked with an illustrator, Steven Guarnaccia, to have all the sort of inspiration or the usages which he had in mind illustrated. And so beside each object, instead of treating it like some sort of pedestal on a pedestal, it was actually brought down to the normal person to understand what was behind it. And this sort of left a lasting impression for me. And even though the cocktail events and the openings were great, I realized that somehow I didn't belong in this temple, that I was sort of more of a ground troops type person. And so I continued in my venture. And what I realized was that I had always processed the world in stories, and I figured that most human beings do. And so as a struggling artist in New York, at one point I figured, I wonder how other struggling artists are living, you know. Is it just me who's so angst-ridden and lost? And so I teamed up with an Italian photographer named Andrea Borgarello, and we started the Bogo Experiment. And the Bogo Experiment meant, besides Borgarello and Gottwald, it also meant buy one, get one free. So the concept was you would get a photographer and a painter doing a work on you. And so we took out an ad in Craigslist, and we said pretty much, hey, creatives, we would like to follow you for a day. And amazingly enough, 5 people contacted us, and they said, sure. And so we ended up following, and it was the concept, ultimately we were following artists that hadn't had a stage yet, that were still sort of emerging and searching for themselves. So we ended up following an aspiring pop star, Coney Island banner painter. Coney Island used to be a freak show. A nomadic artist, a comedian, and a subway artist. And I found their stories completely amazing, and following them and their experience in New York was even more amazing. For example, the subway artist, to be able to play in the subways of New York, it is as competitive as entering an Ivy League school. For 2,000 applicants, they only take 100, and they're not paid for this. They just have a spot underground. The Coney Island painter, for example, came from 3 generations of people working in Coney Island. Her great-grandfather was a master of ceremonies. She had the bearded woman in her backyard, her cemetery. So sort of all of a sudden I was realizing, wow, by giving them a space and sort of presenting their stories, we're validating not only them, but ourselves, and by people on this sort of weird quest together. So this continued, and this continued into India. And in India, we were working on, again, sort of invisible people, and these were people dealing from lower castes. And so we started with the tribal people of Gujarat, who were ultimately still sheep herders and are considered the ancestors of the Roma people today. And then another interesting moment was the Team ritual in northern Malabar of Kerala. And this was a lower caste people who, due to the very rigid and unfair caste system that is in India, they for thousands of years were not allowed to worship in the temples, which were considered for higher caste. And so they had created this really inventive costumes, and they would go into these trances and dances of 13 hours, and they themselves would become sort of godlike figures. And so that very much impressed me, and we got all these stories published. They were all photo photo essays, and then finally paintings where I was describing sort of what couldn't be photographed. And we got called by the city of Moncalieri, next to Torino, to help them with a problem that they had. And the problem that they had was the Roma that had come and moved into their very rich and bourgeois town. And the Roma were living in parking lots and on empty plots. And there was obviously a lot of prejudice and fear about them from the community. And so they said, okay, you guys seem crazy enough. You're dealing with, gypsies in India. Can you come and help us somehow in the story? And so ended up spending 2 months with the Roma and getting into their daily trials and tribulations and problems, and ultimately creating a whole series and stories about them, which ultimately ended up in an exhibition and in a big city council discussion. And we'd realized we'd created a platform for dialogue where people could ultimately start seeing them in a more intimate way. But sort of what haunted me about all of that was that in the end, when I asked the Roma, 80 different members of this different communities, what is your biggest dream? Most of them would say a job. So I thought, wow, yeah, this is great what I'm doing, creating platforms of dialogue. But how can I be more sustainable? How can we leave longer effect of these collaborations? So that brings me to collaborations. And this is when I started at one point being obsessive about Bali. I often decide to go to a new place or country through dreams. And I'll dream so strongly about these places that I already see myself there, and then I end up there, one way or the other. And so in Bali, since Bali is an interesting place, because they were the people from Bali were originally refugees. They're Hindu, which is strange for Indonesia, which is mainly Muslim. And they all have some genetics which goes back to kings, craftsmen, or artists, because the kings, when they were escaping, took with them their artists because they were planning on making again their palaces, etc. So I figured, okay, that's not a bad codex of genetics to have. And I decided I wanted to study batik. And so I came to Ubud, had no sort of concept of where to look, and I was looking and looking, and there were many sort of batik places for painting for tourists, and it just didn't seem the right thing. And then one day, since I became close friends with various people in Ubud, they told me, oh, there's a strange traditional factory in Penang. So to get to Penang, one had to go through a jungle by motorcycle. I don't even know how to ride a bike, but I somehow managed to find someone who would take me on a daily basis. And I came there and I begged them. I said, please, I know it seems weird, but I would really like to learn this technique and understand what it is like to do a craft. And they took me in, and I ended up staying there for 3 months. And although I created a whole series of my own work, what was amazing was that they were inspired by the fact that somebody wanted to learn, and they next year created a school. And with the additional money from the school, they actually managed to uplift their factories, etc. So that was great. And I continued. I came back again, and I wanted to see how could we something like craft, which is so time-consuming and meditative in a way, how can we manage to save it and upgrade it in a society where there's no more time and everything is easy come, easy go consumers? So I was inspired by the Kina shell from Papua New Guinea and the Kalabubu from the Nia Islands, and these were male adornment and warriors. And I decided that this was going to be something that I was going to redesign. So with the craftsmen from Madura and Nusa Penida, we came up with this whole new jewelry line, and it was actually exciting for them and for me. And then I came back to Croatia, and actually we created a whole visual for it, which ultimately then got published in fancy fashion magazines. But ultimately what was important was that the craftsman business went up, and I found a way to somehow create something more sustainable and not lose their skill set. Time goes by, and I started thinking more like an entrepreneur. The way things remain sustainable is if they have a continuous flow of economics. And if the if the concept behind them is something which can be taken into different generations. So, ended up applying for a job here, and this is the most amazing building with the most amazing history. It was not to get into because I see the minutes are going really fast. And ultimately, within 6 months of becoming the director of the GAELLA, I realized that they were going bankrupt. And this was something that no one had really explained to me. But what was more worrying than the financial situation was the fact that nobody gave a damn. And not even the members really cared that this black hole falls down. And it was a recession in Croatia, but most of the time it is. And so I said, oh God, what am I going to do? Like, you know, now they put the diaspora scapegoat. I'm going to be the one closing the door? Hell no, because this is the first round exhibition space in Europe. It's the oldest artist association in the region, and I just felt it didn't deserve to die. And so I figured creatives make something out of nothing. And so I came up with Artomat. And Artomat was made with 0 budget. First year we had 14 days of programming, 9 hours a day. And we had a most amazing outpouring of solidarity of various artists. So what we had done was we had just opened the doors of the GAELLA wide open and said, street artists, designers, craftspeople, artists, come, show us what you got. We have to remember that people forget why art is important, why creativity is important. To make a long story short, I can't believe I'm going to go way over my time. Artomat consisted of 5 things. One was this fair, where, as you can see here, there was various different types of objects, and people were able to present themselves first time to a wider public. Another part was always giving free education. I believe people cannot assume that art is important or creativity is important unless they have felt it on their own skin. So always was a concept, even if we had absolutely no money, workshops had to be for free. Then showing the creative process. Here's a mandala done by Sasha Živković. I wanted people to see how things birth from an idea to completion. To the wonderful program of Melinda Šeftić, this is actually 280 meters below, and they would, within 18 hours, people could interact and get and draw, and they would create this enormous work of art. To creating moments which created inclusiveness. This was the Kandinsky Experiment, and here my whole concept was, I hate the word special needs. If anything, I feel I have special needs, but I think that people with special needs have special talents. And this was actually done with the Association of the Blind, and we would bind everybody's eyes and have different types of live music, and people would paint without 1 cent. And we realized that the Association of the Blind actually helped us see. And we enabled projects like this with Kamensko, bringing designers and artists together, creating new. And then one of the major things that I want to tell you about was Krešo Kapulica. So he came and told me, I have a crazy idea. And I said, what is it? I mean, the whole place is falling apart. What can be crazier than that? And he said, well, I want to put lanterns and have them be lifted in front of the GAELLA. I said, well, you know, geez, I've seen that in Thailand, but it was always by the water or the sea. Like, okay, why not? Let's do it. Why not? Later on, obviously thinking that I might cause anarchy, burn down the building, and, you know, it would be much worse than I thought before. And so it actually turned out to be the most amazing event, which in 4 years went from 100 lanterns and 300 participants to, in the 4th year, 1,000 lanterns and 10,000 people. So what this brought me to was that it was so important to create community. And in a country like Croatia, which has unfortunately been so polarized, this was a very important task to do. And I realized that these platforms, Artomat ultimately was a platform, is what I wanted to continue developing. So I came to Dubrovnik. Oh, these were the results of Artomat. There you go, everyone's impressed. Okay, then we go to these platforms. And these platforms ultimately for me are the new paradigms. And I've started realizing that creativity is ultimately a combination of things. It's arts, crafts, and science. And when you mix that in with entrepreneurship, healthy entrepreneurship, i.e. cultural entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, we create sort of new paradigms. And with that type of thought process, I came to Dubrovnik. And Dubrovnik, a city which 500 years ago was so innovative, which had, consulates around the world. As a kid, I was going to India and seeing Sveti Vlaho Church. And all of a sudden, it became a city where commodity had become more important than community, where innovativeness had been lost, and where people, again, were being somehow ignored. And so the concept was, how do we create such a platform, an international platform in a place like Dubrovnik that deserves it? And this is the concept which we're working on now in Lazareti. The thing with the new paradigm and why I believe these are the paths of the future is that I see them happening all over the world. I could spend another hour, even though I'm already way over my time, just talking about the positive examples of new methodologies of working. And this is a sign of a shift of consciousness. And we have to shift our consciousness, because if you look around us, we're surrounded by destruction. We're killing our planet. We have created the largest number of extinct species since the time of the dinosaurs. The Great Barrier Reef has been proclaimed dead after 25 million years. We're continuous wars, refugee crises, could go on. And we all of a sudden have to start thinking, are we going to be witnesses and part of this fear factor? Or are we going to somehow activate and be part of the solution? So pretty much to sum it down, what I've learned in this sort of journey so far is that problems are often opportunities in disguise. That whenever you can, collaborate instead of compete. Because competing feeds the ego while collaboration feeds the soul. And even though not everyone is meant to be an artist, everybody, absolutely everybody, has creativity within them. And that is an amazing gift, and it is a gift which could have us create a different type of future. So I leave you with the wise words of Carl Jung. If you're a gifted person, it doesn't mean that you gain something, it means that you have something to give back. Thank you. Hvala.